A young man jumped out of a second-story window of a house on a quiet night. This is what really happened in the Hyde Park neighborhood of Kansas City on April 2nd, 1988, which happened to be the day before Easter. The young man, Christopher Bryson, jumped from the second floor with his heart pounding like, and then quickly ran to the door of a home, banging on it repeatedly. A few minutes later, the homeowner, who had been awakened, he opened the door and saw a very distressed Bryson, who was almost naked and had something like a dog collar around his neck. The homeowner realized that this was likely a special event and quickly called the police. During the time he waited for the police to arrive, Christopher Bryson told a horrific story of what he had experienced in that house. Bryson was only 22 years old, and he was one of the rare males who worked in a particular profession, often going to bus stops and bars to get some customers in order to support his family. 5 days before Easter, Bryson met a customer near the old Greyhound bus station in downtown Kansas City named Robert Berdella, the owner of the house. At the time, Berdella suggested that they go to his house, which would make for a more moody atmosphere. And Bryson was pleased with the idea because he was used to staying in cheap motel rooms in the back seats of automobiles, but going to the house would make the transaction more interesting. Bryson spent some time at Berdella's house, and they had a romantic candlelight dinner, a time where they got to know each other, when Bryson just thought he had met a great customer. After dinner, Berdella suggests that they go upstairs. Bryson is puzzled, and Berdella explains that they are on the first floor, where there are two very aggressive dogs, and upstairs, where the room has a fancy television and comfortable furniture. On the way up the stairs, Bryson walks in front of Berdella, mumbling something about wanting to see the decorations on the second floor in a hurry. However, he does not realize that Berdella is behind him with a hammer in her hand, and as Berdella raises the hammer and keeps hitting Bryson on the back of the head, Bryson falls to the ground, and as he falls into unconsciousness, Berdella takes a Polaroid and hits Bryson on the back of the head. While he was in a coma, Berdella continued to photograph Bryson with a Polaroid camera. Over the next 4 days, Bryson was subjected to many different types of torture by Berdella, who beat Bryson with a crowbar and injected animal tranquilizers and antibiotics into various parts of his body. Berdella immobilized different parts of Bryson's body with clamps, tortured Bryson in a variety of brutal ways, and threatened Bryson by saying, "I had several men before you, but they didn't cooperate, so I killed them and had the two vicious dogs eat them." Bryson heard these words and cooperated with Berdella in order to survive because he believed that everything Berdella said was true. During the first few days of Bryson's control, if Bryson yelled, Berdella poked a syringe into his throat and threatened to make him lose his voice completely if he continued to yell. And Berdella even stabbed him in the eye with a cotton swab that was coated with a chemical such as gasoline or detergent. At the time, Bryson thought he would never see his family again, but he never gave up hope of escaping. On the very night that Bryson decided to escape, he made a lot of effort. Bryson had been cooperative with Berdella's behavior and was allowed to hold the remote control for the television, though his hands were still tied with rope. Earlier that day, Bryson had been given a cigarette for his cooperation, and Berdella had placed the matches next to the bed. At first, Bryson wasn't sure if Berdella was at home, so he used the remote control to lower the volume of the television to test if Berdella was there. If Berdella had been home, he would have warned Bryson. Fortunately, the test indicated that Berdella was not at home. Bryson then began to work on his escape. He first untied one hand from the rope and then burned the rest of the rope with a match. However, with two vicious dogs downstairs, Bryson realized he had no other option but to jump from the second floor. Although he hurt his foot upon landing, it did not hinder his ability to escape. Ignoring the pain, he ran down the street to find the nearest house. After Bryson recounted his ordeal, the police arrived and some of the surrounding neighbors came to see what had happened. After Bryson recounted his ordeal, many people refused to believe that Berdella had held Bryson captive, believing that Bryson had framed Berdella. Because in their eyes, Berdella is a very good person, he participated in many charity organizations specializing in finding jobs for young men or providing shelter for men who have no place to live. And in addition to charity activities, Berdella also participated in organizing the community's security work, specializing in catching undesirable youths. So in their eyes, Berdella is a very trustworthy person. However, the police would not change their goal just because of some words. Especially when they saw the dense bruises on Bryson's body, they had every reason to believe Bryson's words. Therefore, when Bryson was sent to the nearby hospital to receive medical treatment, the police still waited for Berdella to come back home at the same place. When Berdella came home and saw the police, he seemed surprised, except that he was still under arrest. But Berdella refused to allow the police to search his home because they did not have a warrant. And according to the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be infringed. This means that generally, police searches require obtaining a warrant issued by a judge. But the police were prepared for this, and because of Bryson's injuries, they had already obtained a search warrant. When the police attempted to enter Berdella's house, they were greeted by the two very aggressive dogs that Berdella owned and waited until Animal Services had safely removed the dogs before entering the house. When several officers entered the house, it was littered with boxes, magazines, clothes, and some strange objects, and the floor was littered with untreated dog feces. After the officers cautiously made their way up to the second floor, they were stunned when, in the second floor bedroom, they found evidence that corroborated Bryson's report: a blood-stained bed with burnt rope on it. Next to the bed was a metal pole, a tray of hypodermic needles, swabs, and droppers. On the floor nearby was an electrical transformer with clamps on the end of the wires. But that's not all they found. After testing, the house showed large amounts of blood in all corners, especially in the basement and bathtub. As Bryson said, there were more than 350 Polaroids showing young men in various stages of torture, some of whom appeared to be dead. Among all the disorganized clutter, they also found two human skulls, an envelope full of human teeth, and what looked like human vertebrae. Forensic anthropologists analyzed the skulls. One was a high-quality replica, but the other was very real and belonged to a young man who had died about a year earlier. Dental records showed that the skull belonged to Robert Sheldon, a poor victim. In fact, police also found a hacksaw, miter saw, and chainsaw in the house, especially the chainsaw with blood, tissue, and human hair. In the backyard, they found another human skull and a small bone fragment, which was later identified as Larry Pearson's. Most distressingly, on the dresser, they found a book written by Berdella. In it, he detailed the gruesome accounts of each victim. As a result, the Kansas City Police Department formed a task force to dig into Berdella's past and try to identify the people shown in the photographs. Many of them corresponded to people who had disappeared since 1984. On July 22, 1988, Berdella was charged with the murder of Larry Wayne Pearson. The following month, in the prosecution for the murder of Robert Sheldon, Berdella pleaded guilty. However, he was not sentenced to death because his attorney arranged a plea bargain in exchange for his confession. Berdella also confessed to murdering a total of 6 men, all between the ages of 18 and 21, beginning in 1984. In each case, the details of how he seduced them and the exact methods of torture he used were different. But the overall modus operandi was the same. Once they were inside his house, he either drugged them or knocked them out and tied them up. Over the course of hours or days, he would torture them repeatedly, just as he had done with Bryson. Some of them died as a result of his torture, and some he suffocated with plastic bags or sticks. Once his victim died, he would throw away the body with other garbage. Berdella was then sentenced to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, and while incarcerated, he railed against the media for dehumanizing him, saying that he was really a good man, and he filed several lawsuits against the prison for abuse. In the fall of 1992, Berdella wrote a letter to a priest who was his friend, claiming that prison officials had denied him heart medication. Then, on October 8, 1992, Berdella, 43, died of a heart attack at the state prison in Jefferson City, Missouri. Until after Berdella's death, however, there were still many people who wondered why Berdella did what he did, and some media outlets dug deeper into Berdella's life in order to report on the case in more detail. On January 31st, 1949, Berdella was born in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, a quiet suburb of Cleveland, much like the neighborhood where he would later live. Berdella was raised in a devout Roman Catholic household by his father, a dye blender for the Ford Motor Company who regularly beat him with a belt, and his mother, a homemaker. From an early age, Berdella was a loner, and because of his severe nearsightedness, high blood pressure, and speech impediment, he was an easy target for bullies, including his father, who would physically and verbally abuse Berdella because of his lack of athletic ability. Berdella's life began to deteriorate when he reached the age of 16, and his father died of a heart attack at the age of 39. Shortly after, his mother remarried, which left Berdella angry and resentful, and it was during this time that he was assaulted by a male coworker at the restaurant where he worked. Being a loner, he read the 1965 adaptation of John Fowles's book, The Collector, about a man who kidnaps a young woman and holds her captive in his basement, which planted a seed in Berdella's mind. Robert Berdella graduated from high school in 1967 and began attending the Kansas City Art Institute, where he was finally able to express himself and come out as gay, having originally wanted to become a professor, but ultimately choosing to become a chef. While at the Art Institute, he was involved in animal mistreatment on at least 3 occasions, 2 of which were with a duck and a chicken, and the third was experimenting with tranquilizers and sleeping pills on a dog. He also embarked on a criminal career, abusing alcohol and selling drugs. At the age of 19, he was arrested for possession of LSD and marijuana, but was released after only 5 days due to lack of evidence. In 1969, he dropped out of school and became a full-time successful chef. As a member of the local Chefs Association, he helped establish a training program for aspiring chefs and was a member of the local crime prevention and neighborhood watch associations. At the age of 32, he quit his job as a chef and opened his own store selling a variety of oddities and antiques. After he came out publicly, he had a brief affair with a Vietnam veteran that didn't last. Instead, he began dating men in specialized professions, befriending them, and even trying to help them out of their bad lives. Then in 1984, Berdella found his first victim, Jerry Howell. Jerry was the 19-year-old son of Paul Howell, one of Berdella's acquaintances in the art dealing business. On July 5th of that year, Berdella offered to drive Jerry to a dance competition in a neighboring town. On the way, Berdella intoxicated Jerry with alcohol and drugged him unconscious. He then strapped Jerry to his bed for 28 hours, during which time he repeatedly tortured Jerry, who could only make desperate pleas, but Berdella was unmoved and continued to torture Jerry until Jerry eventually suffocated from his own vomit. After Jerry's death, Berdella put his body in a separate garbage bag with other kinds of garbage and put them on the roadside for the garbage worker to take away. Berdella's next victim was one of the homeless men he had cared for and exploited over the years, Robert Sheldon. On April 10, 1985, the 23-year-old man arrived at Berdella's doorstep and pleaded with Berdella to let him stay there. Although Berdella was not attracted to Sheldon, he still tormented Sheldon, and starting with Sheldon, Berdella began experimenting with chemicals to torture his victims. He tied piano wire around Sheldon's wrists in an attempt to permanently damage the nerves there, put drain cleaner in his eyes, caulked his ears, and placed needles under Sheldon's fingernails. The following June, Berdella discovered Mark Wallace trying to sleep in his shed, so Berdella drugged Wallace, subjected him to high-voltage electric shocks, and inserted hypodermic needles into his back. Wallace died after several days of relentless torture, and his body was disposed of. The next month, Berdella was contacted by another acquaintance, a man named Walter James Ferris, who wanted to stay at his house. When Ferris arrived, Berdella tied him to his bed and shocked him with 700 volts of electricity, torturing him for 2 days until he died. The following year, Berdella met Todd Stoops, a male with a specialty occupation who had previously lived with Berdella at a nearby park. After Berdella took Stoops back to his house for lunch, Stoops was kidnapped. There, Berdella drugged Stoops and kept him in the house for several weeks, where he attempted to turn Stoops into a slave, tried to disable his vision by electrocuting his eyes, and unsuccessfully attempted to silence him by injecting a cleaning agent into his throat. Stoops eventually died of blood loss. In 1987, Berdella continued to date 20-year-old Larry Wayne Pearson, whom Berdella had met while working at the store. During the date, after Pearson jokingly mentioned his practice of robbing gay men in Wichita, Berdella decided to kill him. He drugged Pearson and continued his cruel punishment by breaking one of Pearson's hands with a metal bar. After 6 weeks of torture, Pearson eventually died. On March 29, 1988, Berdella kidnapped his last victim, Christopher Bryson, and his life of crime came to an end. Discussing Robert Berdella's psychological state is a complex and worthwhile endeavor. In terms of childhood experiences, Berdella was raised in a devoutly Catholic household, where his father's harsh physical punishment, as well as verbal abuse, left Berdella in a state of perpetual fear and depression. Severe myopia, high blood pressure, and a speech impediment in turn made Berdella a target of bullying, which would undoubtedly have a significant negative impact on Berdella's self-esteem and self-perception. The early death of his father and the remarriage of his mother further exacerbated internalized anger and resentment, and these early traumas may have led Berdella to develop a distorted perception of the world. The experience of being assaulted by a male coworker at a restaurant may have created a great deal of distrust in human relationships and may have even triggered a deep-seated desire for revenge in Berdella. Berdella's involvement in the improper treatment of animals during art school and the beginning of his criminal career suggests that Berdella may have vented his inner pain and anger through these actions, and it also reflects Berdella's disregard for life. The book, The Collector, planted the seeds of crime in Berdella's mind, suggesting that Berdella may have found in the book a way to echo his own deepest desires. Berdella began to put his desires into practice by kidnapping and torturing young men in order to satisfy his desire for control and power. Berdella's involvement with men in particular professions may be partly out of necessity, but it may also be that Berdella is looking for a way to control and dominate others. Berdella tried to help them out of their bad lives, perhaps to find a sense of self-worth in them, but this help eventually devolved into brutal exploitation and torture. During the course of his crimes, Berdella kept detailed records of his victims' misery, which suggests that Berdella had a perverse sense of satisfaction and fulfillment with his actions. Berdella lashed out at the media for dehumanizing him while he was incarcerated and filed a lawsuit against the prison for cruelty, suggesting that Berdella may have lacked a sense of self-control over his actions. Berdella may have lacked true awareness and remorse for his actions, and continued to attempt to defend his image and rights. Overall, Berdella's psychological state is the result of a combination of factors, including childhood trauma, adverse experiences, psychological distortions, and a desire for power and control. Exploring Berdella's psychological state can help us better understand the causes of criminal behavior and how to prevent similar tragedies from happening again.